Pinewood Estates was, at first glance, the kind of suburban enclave that most people only witnessed on glossy real estate brochures. It featured manicured lawns, tall oak trees lining the sidewalks, and driveways that were almost unervingly pristine. Each house had a matching mailbox, a short walkway to the front door, and a meticulously uniform hedge marking the boundary between properties. The HOA rulebook mandated the same variety of curbside trash cans for every home, and heaven help you if you left them out on the street one day too long. Most residents accepted these rules as the price of living in what they considered a nice neighborhood. Rarely did anyone question the uniform guidelines about paint colors, porch decorations, or what could and could not be placed on the lawn. It was just the way things were in Pinewood Estates. Yet behind the appearance of perfect conformity, pockets of resistance naturally formed. Some grew frustrated by the constant oversight, longing to add more personality to their homes. Others felt the watchful eyes of the HOA leadership had grown too invasive over the years. Among that leadership was a woman named Belinda Arliss. She served on the HOA board as a self-appointed enforcer, though her official title was just treasurer. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her by the nickname Karen, which circulated quietly behind her back. She appeared to thrive on wielding authority, even when that authority was questionable. She had the kind of stare that could make a grown man apologize for leaving his garden hose stretched across his lawn. Clad in crisp pastel blouses and perfectly pressed slacks, she bustled around Pinewood Estates on foot, carrying either a notepad or an iPad to document violations. Karen's corner house sat on Willow Path in Meadowdale Lane, a property as polished as she was exacting. A professional landscape company visited weekly to trim the sculpted shrubs that flanked her front windows. Her outdoor decor was sparse. Nothing stood out as colorful or quirky. She liked it that way. Uniform, rigid, predictable. If a single weed dared to sprout between the cracks in her driveway, she'd be out with a small trowel in minutes, muttering how the HOA should enforce better weed control measures on the entire block. On the opposite end of the street, in a ranch-style home, lived Walter Jameson. He was a soft-spoken retiree in his mid-70s, with kind eyes and hair that had turned to silver long ago. If Karen represented the cold face of conformity, Walter stood for quiet creativity. He had been a resident of Pinewood Estates for decades, long before the modern wave of hyperregulation took hold. Though he maintained his lawn respectably, Walter's real passion was his workshop, an old garage he had converted into a tidy little space filled with woodworking tools and scraps of pine, cedar, and oak. Walter's late wife, Margaret, had battled a long illness before passing a year prior. Grief-stricken but determined to keep himself occupied, Walter took to carving birdhouses. He found solace in shaping the wood, sanding rough edges, and painting cheerful designs on the tiny structures. Some birdhouses resembled miniaturized Victorian homes, complete with little shutters and hand-cut shingles. Others had whimsical shapes. One was topped with a turret like a medieval castle. Another featured a curved roof inspired by Japanese architecture. Walter spent hours on each creation, forgetting his sorrow in the delicate motions of carving and painting. Eventually, these birdhouses found their way onto his front porch. He hung them from hooks along the eaves, carefully spacing them so each had room. Slowly, local finches, sparrows, and even the occasional cardinal began to nest in the shelters. Walter delighted in the fluttering activity each morning. Neighbors who passed by often stopped to admire the bright colors. Some complimented Walter, praising his craftsmanship. A few asked if he sold them, but Walter politely declined. The work was more personal therapy than a commercial venture. For a few weeks, Walter's birdhouses went unnoticed by the more officious members of the neighborhood, including Karen. But one mild afternoon, Karen stood at the end of Walter's driveway, iPad in hand, and zoomed in on the distinctive shapes dangling from his porch. She counted 7. 7 unauthorized structures, she said under her breath. To her, the birdhouses weren't charming or creative. They violated a sense of strict uniformity. Pinewood Estates had guidelines about exterior decorations, She knew them all by heart. The neighborhood's official rulebook included a broad statement under regulations for outdoor ornamentation, reading, "Homeowners shall maintain tasteful decor that aligns with the community's aesthetic standards, avoiding any overabundance of items that may lead to a cluttered appearance." Karen read this line multiple times, highlighting it on her iPad. She believed Walter's 7 birdhouses constituted overabundance. That night, she composed an email to the entire HOA board, subject line in bold text, "Urgent violation, birdhouses." In her message, Karen attached photos she had taken, accompanied by a bullet point list of potential hazards: increased bird droppings, scattered seeds attracting rodents, possible noise issues in the early morning. She ended with a flourish. "We must act to preserve the quality and property values of Pinewood Estates." Most board members found Karen's email dramatic, but decided to humor her by scheduling a quick discussion at the next monthly meeting. Normally, these meetings were routine, reviewing budget items, scheduling lawn care rotations, discussing minor improvements to the entrance sign. On the night of the meeting, Karen arrived with a folder overflowing with printed photos of Walter's porch. She also brought typed notes, which she read aloud as soon as the meeting started. "Residents have complained of seeds dropping onto walkways, potentially causing weed growth in sidewalk cracks," she read. Additionally, the presence of numerous birdhouses may encourage early morning chirping, which might disrupt neighbors' peace. She flipped a page. This could even lead to rodent issues, as leftover seeds might attract mice or rats. A middle-aged board member named Henry Clark raised a hand. "I've walked by Walter's place a few times. I never saw rodents," he said. "I think the birdhouses are kind of neat, actually." Another board member chimed in. "This feels like we're overreacting. Has anyone else officially complained besides Karen?" The table fell silent for a moment. After a pause, Karen insisted she had verbal complaints from multiple neighbors who felt too uncomfortable to come forward publicly. "I'm just doing my duty," she said, feigning humility. In the end, the board compromised. They agreed to send Walter a cordial letter asking him to ensure minimal seed spillage. The letter would suggest he consider specialized feeders or trays. Karen left the meeting frustrated. She wanted a mandate forcing Walter to remove the birdhouses altogether. But the rest of the board did not share her urgency, seeing no major threat in the cheerful, handcrafted items. Walter soon received the HOA letter, which politely mentioned that while his birdhouses were lovely, could he please ensure that any feeding points had trays to catch stray seeds? Walter, ever affable, had no intention of causing trouble. He immediately researched better seed storage and no-mess feeders. He even ordered custom trays online. But before the trays arrived, Karen continued to pass by his porch with a hawk-like vigilance. She noted the presence of seeds on the ground. Some birds inevitably scattered them as they ate. To Karen, this was outright defiance. That Saturday morning, Walter left to pick up some fresh paint from the hardware store. The street was quiet except for a few joggers and dog walkers. Karen was out on one of her habitual patrols. She marched right up to Walter's porch, scanning each brightly painted birdhouse. The morning sunlight caught the glint of her iPad's camera lens as she took more photos. Suddenly, rage overcame her. She rummaged through her large leather purse and drew out a small hatchet, something she'd bought at a camping supply store just in case. The next moments unfolded like a bad dream. Karen raised the hatchet and began hacking into the birdhouses. A neighbor across the street, Margaret, saw everything from her window and dashed outside to intervene. But Karen was swift, fueled by a bizarre sense of righteous indignation. She chopped each birdhouse from its hooks, smashing and splintering Walter's painstaking craftsmanship. Margaret shouted, "Stop it! You can't do that!" Karen snarled back, "Watch me." The HOA has every right to remove unauthorized clutter. With each swing, vibrant bits of painted wood scattered. Seeds spilled onto the porch, ironically creating the very mess Karen claimed to abhor. By the time Margaret threatened to call the police, Karen had finished her vandalistic deed. She stomped away, hatchet in hand, leaving the porch in ruins. When Walter returned, he found an officer speaking to Margaret. Shards of wood littered the porch. Bright paint chips covered the steps, along with birdseed scattered like confetti. Margaret looked close to tears as she recounted what she had witnessed. The police officer took photos, jotted notes, and asked Walter if he wanted to press charges. Though his heart was heavy, Walter agreed. He couldn't allow such cruel destruction to pass unchallenged. News of the incident spread through Pinewood Estates in record time. Most neighbors were aghast that an HOA official, someone meant to uphold community standards, would commit such a violent, destructive act. Over the next few days, supportive messages appeared at Walter's door. Small letters of sympathy, offers to help rebuild, even gift cards to hardware stores. Some residents openly denounced Karen at the next board meeting, demanding she be removed. That meeting was a spectacle. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was protecting property values from the threat of bird-related damage. The rest of the board members, however, would have none of it. Henry Clark gave a speech condemning vigilante actions. No rule in the HOA guidelines grants you permission to vandalize a homeowner's personal property, he said. A vote was held to expel Karen from her position on the board. It passed unanimously. The police report led to charges of misdemeanor vandalism. Karen found herself facing a court date. She tried to spin the story to her advantage, telling friends and neighbors that she was acting in the best interest of the community. But almost no one believed her. Photos of the ruined birdhouses made the rounds on social media. The beloved crafts that Walter had poured his heart into stood shattered in countless images, a testament to Karen's misplaced rage. The day in court was sobering for Karen. Walter testified, explaining that these birdhouses were more than simple ornaments. They were a form of therapy after the loss of his wife, each one a loving tribute crafted with care. He described how heartbroken he felt upon seeing them in pieces, the hours of labor undone in moments. Karen tried to speak about seeds and rodents, but the judge reprimanded her for taking the law in her own hands. In the end, Karen was ordered to pay Walter for the cost of materials and the time he invested in making the birdhouses. More significantly, she was sentenced to community service. She would spend weekends picking up trash in a local park and removing graffiti from benches, an ironic twist for someone who claimed to be cleaning up the neighborhood. With Karen's iron grip on the HOA gone, Pinewood Estates began to evolve. Residents realized how suffocatingly strict some guidelines had become. While no one wanted the neighborhood to fall into disarray, there was a collective agreement that personal expression ought to be allowed, within reason. The board revised certain rules to allow small changes in mailbox design or front porch decorations. They established clearer, more reasonable boundaries, determined that tasteful individuality didn't have to conflict with property values. Walter, meanwhile, found himself showered with kindness. Many neighbors donated supplies to help him rebuild his collection of birdhouses. Some placed commissions for birdhouses of their own, eager to decorate their porches now that they had more freedom. Children grew excited about birdwatching, pointing out different species that visited the feeders. Walter held informal woodworking lessons in his garage, teaching novices how to build simpler models. The local press got wind of the story. HOA official destroys seniors' birdhouses with a hatchet. It went viral in the region. While the coverage was sensational, it also highlighted how the neighborhood came together in support of Walter. Over time, Pinewood Estates became known for its charming, handcrafted birdhouses and a blossoming bird population that added music to every morning. Spurred on by the goodwill swirling around Walter's creations, the HOA, under new leadership, organized the first annual Pinewood Birdhouse Festival. It was a celebration of art, nature, and community spirit. The event took place on a sunny Saturday in late spring, a day when the breeze carried the scent of freshly mowed grass and blossoming flowers. Neighbors set up tables on the wide sidewalks, displaying a plethora of birdhouses. Some were whimsical, sporting bright polka dots or stripes. Others took on themes: tiny pirate ships, miniature log cabins, or replicas of historical landmarks. Children helped paint and decorate, while older residents swapped birdseed recipes to attract different species. Local bakeries donated bird-shaped cookies, and a small jazz band played in the cul-de-sac. Walter, of course, was the guest of honor. Although he was humble by nature, everyone insisted he be recognized for the patience and kindness he had shown, even after the traumatic incident. He gave a short speech, thanking the community for their support. "I never expected all this," he admitted, voice trembling with emotion. "I just wanted to brighten my porch, and now it seems we've brightened the whole neighborhood." Throughout the day, families strolled by, admiring the colorful displays. Children giggled as they watched real birds swoop down to the newly installed feeders. A raffle drew in modest funds, which the HOA pledged to donate to a wildlife conservation group. It was a grand success, transforming Pinewood Estates' public image from a place of rigid conformity to one that celebrated creativity and unity. Karen stood on the fringes of the festival. She had shown up only briefly, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses, perhaps hoping to blend into the crowd unnoticed. A few people recognized her, but avoided eye contact, still harboring anger or resentment. Others gossiped in hushed tones about whether she felt regret. She lingered near a table displaying a row of brand-new birdhouses that Walter had made with volunteers from the neighborhood's new birdhouse club. In her arms, Karen carried a small brown paper bag. Inside it was a crude wooden box she had tried to construct herself. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she had followed an online tutorial on birdhouse building. Her creation was lopsided, with uneven paint and a hole too small for most birds. Yet she clung to it, uncertain if she would have the courage to show it to anyone, especially Walter. She spotted Walter sitting on a folding chair, chatting amiably with a group of neighbors. He seemed content, even joyful, though a subtle sadness lingered in his expression whenever the conversation touched on the memory of the destroyed birdhouses. With measured steps, Karen approached, her heart pounding. The neighbors fell silent as they saw her. "Walter," she managed to say, her voice trembling. I just want to say," she faltered, glancing at the ground. Then, carefully, she handed him the paper bag. Walter, puzzled, peeked inside, withdrawing the crooked wooden box. Karen swallowed hard. "I tried to build this," she said quietly. "I'm not very good at it, obviously. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix what I did." A hush fell over the little group. Walter looked at the box, turning it in his hands. Despite its flaws, he recognized the effort. Someone who had likely never picked up a hammer before, attempting to make amends in the only way she could think of. He took a breath, meeting Karen's eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "Apology accepted." Karen nodded, tears threatening to spill. She turned away quickly, unwilling or unable to linger. Though it was a small gesture, that battered little birdhouse would become a symbol of what had happened at Pinewood Estates. From anger and destruction, a chance for understanding and repentance. Some of the neighbors watching felt their anger lift, replaced by a cautious relief that Karen might be learning from her mistakes. In the weeks that followed, Pinewood Estates continued to evolve. More residents planted flowers to attract pollinators. The local environmental committee helped install bat houses along the wooded edges to control mosquitoes naturally. A sense of pride in nature replaced the purely cosmetic obsession with identical lawns. The once formal, impersonal atmosphere was replaced with pockets of genuine camaraderie. People chatted more, shared gardening tips, and admired each other's newly painted front doors, no longer forced to choose from just two approved colors. Walter rebuilt his collection of birdhouses, this time making them even more whimsical. He featured swirling designs of vines and blossoms, or miniature picket fences around the small entry holes. The birds returned, chirping happily in the dawn light, a sound that many residents now cherished. Children eagerly pointed out the different species, learning to recognize a goldfinch or a cardinal by sight or call. Meanwhile, Karen served out her community service hours. Every weekend, she donned a reflective vest and picked up trash in the local park. Passers-by occasionally recognized her, and she would offer a tight, uncomfortable smile. Gradually, she settled into a routine, no longer storming around with the righteous indignation she once harbored. The old version of Karen, patrolling with an iPad, brandishing the HOA rulebook, felt distant and irrelevant in a community that had reclaimed its warmth. Word of Pinewood Estates' transformation reached beyond its borders. Other neighborhoods grappling with strict HOAs noticed what happened. The moment an overzealous official took things too far, the residents united to demand change. In some ways, Karen's rampage became the catalyst for a reevaluation of rigid neighborhood governance. People recognized that there's a difference between maintaining standards and squelching individuality. Local journalists wrote follow-up pieces, emphasizing how Walter and his birdhouses had sparked not just an outcry, but a positive movement toward a closer-knit, nature-friendly neighborhood. The media interest generated curiosity among prospective homebuyers, who were drawn to Pinewood Estates not for its rules, but for its sense of unity and charm. Property values, ironically, began to rise as the area earned a reputation for neighborly support and family-friendly appeal. Walter seldom spoke of the day he discovered his destroyed birdhouses. However, he couldn't erase the memory entirely. When he closed his eyes, he still saw jagged scraps of painted wood strewn across his porch. Yet time and goodwill soothed the sting. As he crafted each new birdhouse, he reminded himself that even from wreckage, beauty can emerge. He didn't hate Karen. He pitied her in some sense, imprisoned by her own need to control everything. Her apology, though awkward, had shown a crack in her armor. Over time, he even mustered a sense of empathy. Losing his wife taught him the fragility of life, and how easily hearts can harden when grief or fear takes hold. While Karen's act was different in nature, he suspected there was pain behind her anger. Sometimes he found lumps of seeds that birds spilled onto the porch. He'd smile as he swept them up, remembering how seeds had once triggered so much resentment. Now they were just tiny husks, small remnants of nature's cycle. He placed a new feeder near his rose bushes, a more advanced design with a tray that caught most stray seeds. He quietly marveled that Karen's meltdown had, in the end, made him a better, more considerate caretaker of the birds he loved. Encouraged by the success of the first festival, the HOA scheduled a second one the following year. This time, it was more elaborate. They hosted workshops on painting and construction, taught by volunteer artisans. A local nursery set up a stall selling native plants. Food trucks arrived, offering coffee, sandwiches, and pastries. Students from a nearby high school's environmental club gave a presentation on the importance of bird habitats, awarding a small plaque to Walter, naming him an honorary habitat hero. Karen attended as a volunteer. After spending so many weekends cleaning the local park, she found herself unexpectedly knowledgeable about waste management. She helped the festival committee set up recycling bins and made sure trash didn't overflow. Though some residents still eyed her with lingering mistrust, a few thanked her politely for her work. It wasn't forgiveness so much as acceptance that she, too, lived in Pinewood Estates. Walter noticed Karen stacking chairs at the end of the day. She seemed tired. Despite everything, a small pang of sympathy nudged him. He approached, asked if she needed help. She refused with a stiff shake of her head, but for once, there was no hostility in her eyes. An uneasy truce had formed, built on a sense that both had experienced the extremes of conflict, and both wished to move on in some way. In the months that followed, Pinewood Estates settled into a new normal. Birdsong at dawn became as much a part of daily life as the newspaper. Walter occasionally sold a birdhouse or two at local craft fairs, not for profit, but as a way to spread the love of his hobby. The board revised guidelines, clarifying that while the HOA did reserve the right to address serious issues, it would not micromanage every decorative choice a homeowner made. The atmosphere was lighter, friendlier. And Karen? She was no longer an HOA member, but she still lived on Willow Path. Sometimes, she grumbled about neighbors who let dandelions go to seed or kids who left bikes on driveways. She would catch herself, biting her tongue before sending an angry email. Perhaps she had realized that heavy-handedness would only push people further away. Instead, she walked her small dog around the block in the evenings, nodding curt hellos at those who passed. If folks were polite enough to greet her, she offered a short response. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it wasn't open hostility either. Walter saw her every now and then, often with a tiny hatchet of guilt behind her eyes. Once in a while, a child or a new resident, unaware of the old drama, would wave at Karen, simply seeing her as another neighbor. On those rare occasions, her expression softened, as though remembering a life before she became the so-called Karen of Pinewood Estates. At sunrise, the neighborhood came alive with chirping birds. Each house now displayed some personal flair, be it a row of potted flowers, a unique mailbox, or a small piece of lawn art. The uniform harshness that once defined Pinewood Estates had given way to a tapestry of subtle variety. Yet, it remained tidy and pleasant, the perfect compromise between order and individuality. Walter, enjoying his morning coffee on the porch, watched goldfinches flit to and from a feeder shaped like a miniature castle tower. He had built it in memory of the castle-like birdhouse Karen had demolished. Ironically, the new version was sturdier and even more ornate, a symbol of triumph over adversity. Every day, he found joy in these small, fluttering visitors. They reminded him of Margaret, of love, and of the possibility of renewal in even the most wounded hearts. If you asked anyone in Pinewood Estates about the hatchet incident, they would likely shake their head in disbelief. Some called it an unfortunate mistake. Others labeled it a shocking act of vandalism. But nearly all would agree on one thing. The ordeal fundamentally changed the community for the better. No longer was Pinewood Estates just a perfect facade. Beneath the trimmed hedges and newly planted flowers, a sense of genuine neighborliness had emerged. In a twist of fate, Karen's aggression resulted in the proliferation of birdhouses. Where once only Walter displayed them, now dozens of porches featured small, eco-friendly designs with seed trays and nesting compartments. Bird watching became a pastime, bridging age gaps and forging friendships between people who might never have otherwise spoken. Parents taught their children about local species, standing outside at dusk, binoculars in hand. Early risers snapped photos at dawn, posting them on local social media pages. The community reveled in nature's simple wonders. The moral of Pinewood Estate's story was as clear as the bright cardinal perched on Walter's feeder. One person's destructive impulse could become a catalyst for collective growth. Karen's name still floated around as a cautionary tale, a reminder that cruelty, once unleashed, can have far-reaching effects. But it was also a lesson in how empathy, cooperation, and forgiveness can transform a place and the hearts of its inhabitants. Walter, nearing his late 70s, was no longer lonely. He had found renewed purpose, new friends, and countless requests for custom birdhouses. His workshop sometimes bustled with visitors, novice carpenters eager to learn from him. His once quiet street was now alive with conversation. And through it all, the birds continued to sing, a daily chorus of resilience and hope. In the quiet dawns of Pinewood Estates, while soft sunlight bathed the symmetrical lawns, a subtle wonder had taken root. Not uniformity, but harmony, of each resident's individuality, of delicate wild creatures thriving alongside orderly hedges, and of the human capacity to rise above fear and anger to build a kinder world. The song of every finch and sparrow was proof new life can flourish, even in the wake of destruction. Years would pass, children would grow, and property owners would come and go, but the legend of the hatchet-wielding Karen and Walter's birdhouses lingered in the neighborhood lore. It was told to newcomers as a strange, yet heartening anecdote. How one violent act became the spark that lit a torch of community spirit. The annual Birdhouse Festival became a cherished tradition, each year bigger than the last. Some residents even joked that the official slogan of Pinewood Estates should be "We turn hatchets into homes for birds." Meanwhile, Walter strolled slower as he aged, but he still greeted each neighbor with a gentle smile. On any given morning, you might see him meticulously adding a fresh coat of paint to another whimsical birdhouse. If you asked him about Karen, he would shrug softly and say, "She made a mistake, a big one." but I like to think we all learned something in the end. And as for Karen, she remained there, a subdued figure who had lost her thirst for domination. In time, new neighbors who'd never heard of the incident treated her like anyone else, sometimes with a hesitant wave, sometimes with a passing nod. On occasion, she caught herself reflecting on how differently things might have turned out if she had just tried talking to Walter about his birdhouses. Regret weighed heavily, but she carried on, tending to her yard in quiet solitude, never again daring to brandish a hatchet at another neighbor's creativity. In the hush of twilight, the old feud subsided into the past. Pinewood Estates moved forward, guided by the spirit of collaboration that blossomed after the storm. The air of the neighborhood was no longer thick with rules and intimidation. Instead, it was filled with the lilting symphony of birds that had finally found a safe haven, and of neighbors who, in learning to welcome them, found they had also learned to welcome each other. As summers melted into autumns and winters gave way to spring, Pinewood Estates continued to draw gentle admiration from nearby towns. The Birdhouse Festival had grown into a regional attraction, with vendors setting up booths offering handcrafted feeders, specialized seed blends, and even small lectures on local ecology. Younger residents who once found the suburb dull spoke with pride about their neighborhood's transformation. How a place once defined by strict uniformity had evolved into a beacon of creativity and community engagement. Walter, despite advancing age, persisted in his quiet, steady way of living. Every so often, he welcomed volunteers into his workshop, particularly high school students from a woodshop club. They came to learn the basics of cutting, sanding, and assembly, but they left with something more intangible. An appreciation for the patience and dedication it took to turn simple planks of wood into a home for living creatures. In between hammer taps and the whir of a small drill, Walter would share bits of wisdom he'd gleaned over the years. He told them that a community could be as fragile as a bird's nest, easily toppled by a storm of resentment, yet it could also be rebuilt stronger than before. Karen, meanwhile, kept mostly to herself, but she continued to show up at community functions in small, almost apologetic ways. If there was a park cleanup, she might volunteer for a half hour to pick up trash before slipping away. She stayed at a distance during neighborhood socials, but at least she no longer wore the scowl of old. Some residents noted that she seemed to carry herself more softly, as if acknowledging that her days of rigid oversight had ended. To the surprise of a few neighbors, she even adopted a rescued cat. Though rumor had it she carefully kept the feline indoors so it wouldn't disturb the local birds. The memory of her outburst never fully vanished. Now and then, an older resident might point out a crack in the sidewalk and joke, "At least Karen didn't come at it with a hatchet." But the sting had dulled. Newcomers learned of the story in a roundabout way, usually hearing it from long-time residents who spoke of it with a gentle moral in mind, that no matter how harsh an act of destruction, unity and kindness could outshine it. The cracked birdhouses were long gone, replaced by an entire community's worth of colorful, imaginative creations that soared with possibility. Each spring, as flowers blossomed and nest-building birds flitted around with bits of straw, the cycle of life returned to Pinewood Estates, stronger than ever before. Through the countless small acts of fellowship that followed Karen's rampage, a kind of grace had found its way into daily life. A reminder that even the gravest mistakes can lead to renewal when people choose compassion over conflict. And so, from the seeds that had once been scattered in anger, a garden of understanding and warmth continued to grow, season after season, year after year.